Shortly after I was ordained, my UCC sister clergywoman, Barbara Essex, published the first of what ended up being 2 study guides on bad girls of the Bible. In it, she proposed to look beyond the notoriety that we love to hate and show us women of exceptional boldness, courage, determination, and independence. Now, as a woman with a too big presence and colorful past, at least as was measured by society and most of the men that I threatened, as a woman who was leaving behind the corporate boardroom for the church's pulpit, as a single mother with a brown-skinned baby, I could not wait to get my hands on that book. And Jezebel's was the first chapter I devoured. Essex's work, and since then the work of many feminist scholars, lifts the veil of both the historical context and motivations of the Hebrew Testament writers, and calls into question the contemporary mythologies of good girls, bad girls, and every damning stereotype we have about women, women's bodies, women's sexuality, women's power, and more. Acknowledging the power of story to shape and reshape our ideas and confirm or challenge our biases, Essex decided to lay aside the lovely good news stories about women that we teach in Sunday school, and she mined the stories of biblical women that haunt us. Aware of how much patriarchy has influenced and even manipulated for their purposes biblical stories told or not told about women, aware of how deeply embedded these stories are in our contemporary perspectives and attitudes about women, Essex looked for lessons to be learned from these stories of betrayal, unfulfilled need, dreams, deception, misunderstandings, rejection, exploitation, and sacrifice. And with that list in mind, maybe you, like me, will identify more these next 6 weeks with these bad girls than with, for instance, Mary, the mother of Jesus. And so we begin with the baddest bad girl of them all, Jezebel. The very mention of her name conjures up images of overdone makeup, excessive jewelry and perfume, expensive and inappropriately sexy clothes, and raw sensuality. Her handling of Yahweh's prophet Elijah is mythical. The dispatching of Naboth to take his vineyard for her pouting husband's vegetable garden is infamous. And of course, her death scene, replete with hair, makeup, and costume awards, is legendary. Queen Jezebel is described as devious, evil personified, and a whore. And her name is literally synonymous in Webster's dictionary with shameful wickedness in women. Ask anyone about Jezebel, and an opinion will be at the ready. I mean, how would you respond were I to refer to you as a Jezebel? It will likely not surprise you that there's a long history that precedes American slavery and holds steady through Jim Crow to today, which refers to black women as Jezebels, presumed to be lascivious by nature. This then justifying the ownership, rape, and sexual objectification of black women's bodies and black women's very being. This horrible stereotype is rampant today in popular culture, film, art, music video, pornography, and more. Jezebel's story is used by preachers as a warning to women to avoid a Jezebel spirit. One contemporary female writer suggested that one mustn't be a Jezebel because husbands are in charge. Another posited that her servants, Jezebel's servants, were tired of working for a witch, and that's why they threw her out of the window. You Jezebel, the baddest of the bad, an irredeemable sinner, the Lady Macbeth of the Bible. The descriptors go on, and it seems like pretty much everyone despises her. Yet a deep dive into the context and the culture of this Phoenician princess that history has loved to hate actually unearths another story. We don't have time to do justice to the scholarship that would help us fully understand all that was going on. This was a complicated story with at least 4 acts and many twists and turns. But a few details about the context of the story told will help with our consideration, and I think posit the idea that Jezebel got a bad rap. So, she was an immigrant. She was married cross-culture to gain a military and political alliance that sought recovery for Israel, which was in pretty bad shape at the time. They were struggling with security at the borders, and big guns like Assyria were gaining power. So Jezebel brings Baal with her from Phoenicia, and as a part of the contract, she expects to be able to practice her faith with Baal, with his consort Asherah, and the Israelite state religion that worshiped Yahweh, all coexisting. Kind of like an interfaith or pluralistic society. Other Israelite kings like Solomon did this for their wives, so it wasn't out of the ordinary. So her husband, King Ahab of the northern kingdom of Israel, in support of his new queen, builds a temple for Baal and a shrine for the consort Asherah. And with time, he kind of starts hanging around with the pagans too. And by the way, there was already some serious interest in old Baal there in Israel. Baal was the god of fertility and weather. Pretty attractive stuff if you're an agricultural society who needs good weather and lots of children to work. This, then, is the real problem. There is a vicious religious conflict that plays out through all of these wild scenes of Jezebel and Ahab's reign and Elijah's prophetic practice. There were droughts and prophets and a divine showdown of the gods. Yahweh, of course, wins. There was this ongoing competition between Elijah and Jezebel over faith practice and who was winning followers, during which both of them murdered a whole bunch of people, but only Jezebel was criticized for it. There was the whole vineyard thing, which could be considered ugly for sure, but in context, it was really just about Jezebel wanting to give her husband what he wanted. And she used the law of the land to get what she presumed from her cultural milieu was the right of the king, to take this land that he wanted because he was the king. But okay, history makes it about her being manipulative blankety blank. And then there were all these competing kings killing other kings and then killing the sons of kings who became the king. I mean, who was judging all those military men and politicians and kings doing that killing? Nobody was. Only Jezebel got the rap. So in the context of this really big deal about which God is the one God, the stuff Jezebel did was more about politics, power, and privilege than it was about her personality or sexuality. In fact, there is absolutely no reference to her having or using sex to wield power. And yet this is all we're left with: wanton, shameful wickedness. At the heart of all that was written about Jezebel was the Israelite presumption that Yahweh must be the only God. Today's scholars understand that Jezebel was deliberately painted as a threat to that primacy. You see, for the prophets like zealous Elijah, Yahweh is superior to all the other gods and goddesses put together. And here's the reason why. This God called a tiny, unlikely Israel to rule the world, not for fame and glory, but to be an example of justice, harmony, unity, faith, and love. This God is the God because of what has been done with a motley crew of loosely affiliated tribes. They had to protect the faith because if this weird collection can be transformed into a world power ruling justly and humanely, ruling with concern for all of creation, ruling within the purview of the divine, then this God can and do anything we can imagine. So anything that threatened Israel's ability or capacity to love God had to be destroyed and eliminated. Failure to express this deep loyalty would result in disaster and tragedy. Thus, we find throughout the Hebrew scriptures warnings to stay away from other gods and foreign women. Because you see, it was believed that these foreigners would lure their husbands away from God to Baal. Patriarchy would have us believe that these women are seductive in their use of power, capable of swaying God's chosen men from the course laid out for them. The presumption here is that love or lust makes these men weak and easily influenced. Thus, the women are blamed for the men's weakness. Imagine men who are fearless in battle, men who kill wild animals with their bare hands, men who take down giants with mere stones, men who launch massive building programs in enemy territory, men who judge fairly are all suddenly rendered wimps under the attentions and sensuality of women. Now, I know I'm not alone in having heard that line before. I would go so far as to admit to you that in my generation, I was taught to actually use that to my advantage. Today, that just feels icky. So here we are, among all the dangerous foreign women, Jezebel is depicted as standing alone as the one most able to undermine Israel's faith. And yet we can imagine that everyday people liked her. She was regal, articulate, smart, sensitive, and generous. She was bold and courageous, had really strong leadership abilities, and an assertive personality. And I just want to interject here as a bold woman with an assertive personality, LOL, no wonder she was disposed of. Jezebel was a princess raised to be a queen, and she acted like one, learning the laws of the land, using them to her advantage, and wielding the power afforded her by her throne. Like many of us, Jezebel was raised in a faith tradition that she loved and believed in, and she was a zealot for her gods. She just couldn't understand the insecurity of the Israelite God. This God required absolute loyalty. This God required strict obedience. This God had a long list of do's and don'ts that even the greatest saints would find challenging. This God bragged about and encouraged people to remember deeds of valor and violence. All the while, God's prophets preached doom and gloom. They were kind of depressing. Moreover, for Jezebel, Israel's God may have seemed kind of incomplete, for there was no female counterpart. Besides, Baal had seniority. So Jezebel saw nothing wrong with coexisting and promoting her God. She thought she was doing the bumbling Israelites a favor by providing a more reliable and less demanding God. The truth is, Jezebel was dangerous because she was a somebody before she arrived in Israel. The presentation of her as simply a bad-to-the-bone temptress is misplaced and manipulative. Jezebel was used. The tradition and the patriarchy had no choice but to get rid of all traces of her. And to do that, she was made out to be the scapegoat for all that was wrong in the world. The prophets considered the worship of Baal a dreaded threat to Israel's well-being and their connection to God, and so Jezebel had to die a horrible death. And in fact, hers is the most graphic and horrific death recorded in the Bible. So sinful seductress or savvy stateswoman, she was certainly not a harlot or a seductress. She was not involved in any sexual scenes in the story. She was a woman from another culture and another worldview, trying to adjust in a new and strange land. She was not a villain to be eternally despised. She was religiously committed, politically savvy, determined, self-assured, bodacious, and clever. She was dedicated to her family and a zealous missionary for Baal. And she died as she lived royally. Now, don't get me wrong, there is political intrigue, ugly cruelty, and lots of murder in this story. But Jezebel's story, like so many others, is a rich stew of the historical events, allegorical interpretation, and metaphorical license that makes so many of the Old Testament's biographical dramas such fascinating reading. And that means we must always consider it with care, and as they say in our business, a hermeneutic of suspicion. So what do we take away today besides the impact of patriarchy on history, society, culture, and those who are outside of the patriarchy? Well, for one, we all act out of our cultural understandings and prejudices. It's called implicit or unconscious bias, and that divides and others those who are not us. Despite scholars' efforts to reframe Jezebel's social media footprint, she and Elijah were insensitive and narrow in their worldview. They both presumed that they were in and the other was the other. They never actually had a face-to-face conversation, and neither sought to understand each other's perspectives. Neither considered the possibility of a both-and way of coexisting, and they were both willing to go to their graves to prove their way was the right way. But beloved, as we look for lessons, we must remember that Jesus comes to break down and destroy the barriers we have built to separate ourselves. Much of the story of Jezebel is a clash of cultures. What Jezebel does on behalf of her culture and her faith is wrong. She doesn't see that her use of the power conferred upon her by society is both abusive and one-sided. Can I get an amen? Because we're going to go there. She preaches her faith, but does not operate from a place of love of neighbor. And her actions are not so different from the ways in which we act out of racism, casteism, and other forms of othering that are manifested in our society. Based in the absurd belief in a hierarchy of human value, white supremacy, Christian supremacy, capitalism, and the policies that these have wrought literally ignore the very humanity of people of color, not to mention their culture. That context, like Jezebel and Ahab's, has allowed for us, the privileged, to build institutions and establish systems that benefit us and leave others, especially people of color, out. We're working on it, but historically, those in power easily get away with only superficial attempts to both understand other cultures and people and invest in changing the context. Because we don't lose if we shrug our shoulders and say, oh, well, I'm trying. Our lives don't depend on finding a way to understand and bridge the divide so that we can change the circumstances. On the other hand, like with Naboth, discrimination and ignorance of the culture of people of color is life and death for them. Like with Naboth, the very law of our land is used against those who are not aligned with the dominant culture. So our bad girl was certainly misunderstood and misinterpreted and used by the prophets and patriarchy to protect the God and the culture of the day, but she is still a very cautionary tale for us. Surely, if Jesus was here today, he would have marched across that bridge for gathering people together for justice with Martin Luther King. He would be marching with Moral Monday on behalf of those living in poverty. He would be marching with Black Lives Matter and clamoring for deeper understanding, more equity, and more dialogue. He would be marching for immigrants being held at our borders. He would be marching for reparations for those who have been harmed in the past and police reform for the future. And he would not be worrying about whether or not we were following Yahweh or Allah or Buddha, as long as we were loving the God of our understanding and our neighbor and the earth. And you know what else Jesus would be doing? He would be praying for us to use our power for love and understanding. May it be so. Amen.